Welcome to this episode of Dwayne's Aviation. A wise man once said, smash that like button and subscribe to our channel. Air Force One is not an actual plane. Air Force One is an air traffic control call sign for one of two planes that are at the president's disposal. However, it should be noted that any aircraft of the military that the president flies on becomes one. If the president jumps into a U.S. Air Force aircraft, it becomes Air Force One. The president rides in U.S. Army aircraft, then it becomes Army One. And if he goes on any U.S. Navy aircraft, then whatever he flies on becomes Navy One. The helicopter that ferries the president from the White House to Joint Base Andrews is called Marine One because it belongs to the United States Marine Corps. And finally, if the president happens to fly a plane that doesn't belong to the armed forces, then it will be called Executive One. Theodore Roosevelt was the first president to fly, although he was not in office at that time. He hopped on an early Wright Flyer in 1910, which is basically a wooden biplane you wouldn't ever want to get on. The official request for a presidential plane did not come until 1944, because planes were made safer and more reliable during the Second World War. A C-87 Liberator Express was reconfigured for use as the first dedicated VIP and presidential transport aircraft and named Guess Where To, but the Secret Service rejected it because of its safety record. The United States Army Air Forces, now the Air Force, repurposed a C-54 Skymaster for use by President Franklin Roosevelt. They named it Sacred Cow, and it was used until 1947. For the next decade until 1958, presidents flew in the C-118 Liftmaster named Independence, and then on two C-121 Constellations named Columbine II and Columbine III. Now here's where Air Force One became the Air Force One we know today. In 1953, President Eisenhower was flying under the call sign Air Force 8610 in the same airspace where Eastern Airlines Flight 8610. The ATC confused the two flights, nearly causing a crash. Figuring that losing a president like that would be crazy, the call sign Air Force One was implemented so a mix-up like that would never happen again. Then in 1958, still under Eisenhower, Boeing 707s were used as Air Force Ones, and that's when presidents became jet-powered. When John F. Kennedy was sworn in just 3 years later, he was the one who changed the look of the planes. Before then, Air Force One had a red and white color scheme and blocky letters, and that was thought to be too aristocratic. Even JFK said no and recommended Raymond Loewy to design a new color scheme and lettering. Because of him, we now have the presidential seal on the front of the plane, light baby blue coloring, golden band down the center in fancy letters on Air Force One. This is the look most of us are used to today, and the same scheme was kept when Air Force One made the transition to Boeing 747-200 in 1990. To become an Air Force One pilot, you need to join the 89th Airlift Wing in Maryland, and to join the 89th Airlift Wing, you need to be a U.S. Air Force personnel. You simply need to apply for transfer of assignment to the 89th Airlift Wing of the U.S. Air Force's Air Mobility Command. The 89th Airlift Wing is based at Joint Base Andrews, just a couple of miles outside of Washington, D.C. This wing not only flies the president, but cabinet members, members of Congress, just about any number of VIPs that require fast, secure air travel. To apply, you must first be a veteran U.S. Air Force transport pilot. Once you apply, your application will be scrutinized as it has never been before. Now, here's the tricky part. Joining the 89th Air Wing is not where the story ends. To be selected to fly the president, you need to make your way into the Presidential Airlift Group inside the 89th Air Wing. And to join the Presidential Airlift Group, you need to be a high-ranking officer, typically a lieutenant colonel or colonel, a position which requires 22 years of service in the U.S. Air Force, if not more. Much of the operation of the 89th Airlift Wing is not made public, but rest assured, all personnel is checked out thoroughly. So, whenever possible, the president will travel on Marine One. While Marine One is occasionally used to transport the president from point to point, its most frequent mission is to bring the president from the White House to Andrews Air Force Base. The president's planes are based at Andrews Air Force Base, so this 12-mile trip is how the president starts and finishes any long-distance trip. To give you a sense of how efficient this entire transport system is, let's time a trip from the White House to the UN headquarters in New York. The 12-mile flight to Andrews Air Force Base takes about 8 minutes on Marine One. Then, upon arrival, the president steps on board Air Force One. The president is always the last person to step on Air Force One. So the second he is there, the door closes and the aircraft taxis for takeoff. That means there's about 5 minutes between the touchdown of Marine One and the takeoff of Air Force One. From there, it's about a 30-minute flight to JFK Airport in New York, followed by a 7-minute trip on Marine One to downtown Manhattan Heliport, then a 6-minute motorcade to the United Nations. That means that if everything goes perfectly, including transfer times, it will take almost exactly 1 hour for the president to go from stepping out of the White House to stepping inside the United Nations. And what is the cost of this hour-long trip? Well, it's public information that Air Force One costs an estimated $206,337 per flight hour. So, this half-hour flight costs $103,169. But of course, we need to include Marine One. Marine One by itself is actually fairly inexpensive to operate. While we don't know its exact operating costs, one of the helicopters often used as Marine One is the Sikorsky UH-60 Blackhawk, which costs $2,199 per flight hour. The motorcade's cost for the short trip is fairly minuscule, so we'll leave it out for simplicity. But the helicopters and cars need to get to New York, and this is done by loading them up on a C-5 Galaxy cargo plane, which costs $100,941 per flight hour, or $50,471 for the half-hour-long trip to New York altogether. Ultimately, transportation of the president cost the American taxpayers about $350 million per year, roughly 1/4 of the $1.4 billion yearly White House budget. This is certainly a steep price, but many would argue that it's a small price to pay to keep the most powerful person in the world safe. You can support us on Patreon using the link in the description. A wise man once said, "Subscribe for more."